All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of American Library in Paris's Evenings with an Author. I'm Catherine O'Lean, Programs Manager at the library. For those of you who don't know us, I wanted to just say a few words. So we're the largest English language lending library on the continent. That's something we're very proud of. But not only are we a space for books and periodicals and all sorts of resources, but we're also an event space. So obviously, in this period, we've moved our events online, but we continue to attract wonderful speakers and audience members, so we're very happy to have you with us tonight. The American Library is also a nonprofit. We're independent. We don't receive any funding from the French or American governments, but are rather supported by donors and are very happy to, sorry, a couple more people are coming, are very happy to be able to rely on their generosity and the generosity of our members as well. We're 100 years old this year, so 2020 has been an exceptional centennial year. We've had to think of very innovative ways to celebrate through the period of confinement and now sort of post-confinement as we can begin to gather, but maybe not completely safely yet. We're very excited for our Century Gala, which is going to be on October 8th. And if you're interested in learning more about that event, please do visit our website. I believe you still have time to purchase a ticket if you're interested in attending. It will be completely virtual. And in general, you can learn more about us on our homepage, our website, our Facebook page. We have an Instagram, Twitter, and we also have a e-newsletter called eLibris that comes out every 2 weeks, and we'll keep you posted on events like these as well as general library news. So tonight, I'm very pleased to have with me Dr. Alice Jardine. She's Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University. Tonight, she'll be speaking to us about her latest book, sitting right behind me, At the Risk of Thinking, an Intellectual Biography of Julia Kristeva. I had the chance to read this book, and I can promise you that it's not only fascinating, but it's very compelling and also warmly written. So it's definitely written for sort of the beginner, someone who hasn't maybe yet had a chance to encounter much of Kristeva's work, as well as the veteran and the theoretician. So I definitely recommend that book. So Alice is also the author of The Future of Difference, Gynesis, Configurations of Women in Modernity, and Living Attention on Teresa Brennan. She's also at work on a new project. I'm not sure if there'll be time to say a couple words about that, but I know I'm very curious. She's currently writing a book called Picaresque Paris, Bringing Theory Back to Life. And it's about her time living as a young woman in Paris, and there are 20 vignettes, and each one is set in a different arrondissement. So that promises to be exciting as well. And with that, thank you all again for being here, and I'll hand it over to Alice Jardine. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everybody for being here, wherever here is. In this odd new medium, in this strange new world that we're living in. Thank you, I'm very grateful. And Catherine, you've been absolutely heroic pulling this together. And I also want to thank the director. I'm not sure if she's with us right now, but big warm thanks to Audrey Chapuis, who put all of this together. So, so this book took a long time to write. Too long, and it also involved a lot of conversations, and so there's a lot to say, and I see a lot of friends here who I'd love to just sit down and talk about it with. But what I'm going to do with the time I have is divide what I want to share into two parts. And the first part is very informal, and it's basically I'm going to do a kind of establishing shot of the biography, especially for those of you who've not had a chance to look at it, and tell some of my favorite stories, or at least allude to them. And then in the second half, I'm going to be a bit more formal and read just a few pages about why I think the biography is timely and why I think it's important right now, and especially with regard to the Sabina affair of 2018 and beyond. So, so for the establishing shot, there is an introduction, of course, and in the introduction, I try to talk about why I wrote the book, and also mention something Catherine said, which is that it's not for the expert. It's really for the interested reader and interested but non-expert reader. And I dive after that right into Kristeva's life story. And it's in 3 big parts. And part 1, as you would guess, has to do with Kristeva's childhood. From 1941, her birth in Sliven, Bulgaria, until 1965, her departure for Paris. And I try to emphasize in that first part several things that seem to me foundational for understanding who Kristeva has been and her work since then. So I emphasize obviously the socio-historical moment and the risk of totalitarianism, in fact, the everyday life living in a totalitarian state, first with the Nazis and then with the Soviet communists, and war, obviously, and living in that atmosphere with a father who was a devout Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian, and a brilliant man, if I may say so, and a mother who had trained as a scientist. And so between the ultra-Orthodox Christian father and the scientific mother, Kristeva grew up quickly, I would say. I was trying to think of some examples of her childhood characterological self. For example, her toys. I write quite a bit about her toys. She hated dolls. She hated dollhouses a lot. She loved her books. She read voraciously. She loved French books. Another thing that really struck me was both by her account and many others' account, she never cried. If somebody else cried, she would comfort them, but she never cried, which I find fascinating. And also that she was able, I think, from a very young age to, I guess, metaphorize what she was experiencing. So for example, when her sister was being born at their house, of course, she went to the next door neighbor's house and watched the mother give to her daughter 1 spoonful of tap water at a time, 1 spoonful after the other. And Kristeva then went to her parents and said, Mom, Dad, just like communism, 1 spoonful at a time, you get exactly what you need, but you never get what you want. And this was an anecdote that stuck with many of her relatives for many, many years. I also emphasize, obviously, Kristeva's love of language and literature. As a young woman, I emphasize something that she has often talked about, which was her participation in the May 24th Festival of the Alphabet in Bulgaria every year. And I share with my Anglo-American readers the fact that at 21 years old, in 1962, she started writing reviews. She was a journalist and a quite good journalist as a young woman. And she wrote a review of a book by Albert Cohn called Roads and Stops. And she liked that book, but it was a Western pleasure book. And she got in a lot of trouble and had to go into hiding, and her whole family was nervous after she wrote this book praising this Western point of view. And another thing that a lot of, I think, Anglo-American readers don't know about Kristeva is that she wrote her first book at 23 in 1964. And I wish somebody would translate it. I see at least one Bulgarian speaker on the screen. Yeah, it was called Characteristic Trends in 20th Century Western Literature. So somebody should translate that. And it was quite successful. But what's most important in all of that, for me anyway, is that Kristeva, as a young woman, and I mean very young, was involved in a very vibrant dissident community, intellectual community of writers and thinkers. And one of those thinkers was a man named Svetan Stoyanov, who was Kristeva's first sweetheart, first serious sweetheart. And I write quite a bit about Svetan Stoyanov and read as many of his books as I could find in translation to read. And Svetan served as the bridge to part 2 of the book. Of course, the other bridge is that Kristeva got on a plane and went to Paris on a scholarship, which we can talk about if you want later. But meanwhile, back in Sofia, these dissident friends of hers, this community that she had loved and lived with for many years, came under attack. And one after the other were individually rounded up. A lot of Anglo-American readers know about Georgy Markov, for example, very, very famous intellectual who left Sofia in 1969 and was murdered in London with the famous umbrella tip, poison tip in 1978. Vladimir Kostov, and that's a long story, but he was an undercover agent in Paris until 1977 when he defected. But he was targeted just 10 days, I think, before Markov in Paris with the poison umbrella tip, but he survived. And Svetan Stoyanov did not have as good a luck, her sweetheart. Svetan Stoyanov, it's a long story, so in short, he accepted a challenge by the DS, by the first department of the 6th Directorate of the Secret Service, to go to London to try to convince Markov that he should come back to Bulgaria. Now, of course, the Bulgarian government, the communists wanted Markov to come back so that they could imprison him. But Stoyanov wanted Markov to come back so that they could join together to fight the communist regime and the censorship that they felt targets of. And that mission failed. And again, another long story, but let's just say that the DS targeted Stoyanov, and he was sick by the middle of June 1971 and was dead by July 1st, 1971, the exact same moment when allegedly Kristeva was recruited by the DS. But switching back to Kristeva in Paris, what she was doing was meeting all of these intellectuals, many of whom became important mentors to her: Pierre Dax, Louis Aragon, Lucien Goldman, Émile Benveniste, and of course her very, very dear Roland Barthes. She was writing furiously in that same sort of camouflaged, palimpsestic way that she'd had to write in Bulgaria, and we could talk about that as well. She also met, of course, Philippe Solers, and they met in 1966 and were married in 1967. Now, again, what a lot of my sort of Anglo-American readers may not know is that Solers was already madly in love when he met Kristeva. He had met a very famous Belgian writer in 1958, Dominique Rollin, who some of you may have read. And that relationship stayed solid until she passed away in 2012. So Kristeva had to accept that. She had to be willing to go along with that. She would marry Solers for all kinds of reasons. But Dominique Rollin remained very, very central to their lives. And for that reason, I spent quite a lot of time writing about Kristeva's attitude towards and theories about relationship, about love, and about marriage. I have a lot to say about that, but maybe another time. I write about it at some length. I also write about Kristeva's coming to psychoanalysis, her own analysis with Ilse Barrande, the famous trip to China, which some of the people on the screen have written about, in 1974. And of course, the birth of her son, David, in 1975. And with Kristeva's becoming a mother, I move into part 3, which is the longest section of the book. It's called Becoming Julia Kristeva, from 1980 until today. And I do it by decade. And I'm not going to go over all of it right now, just to say that what I try to do is emphasize that which remains consistent across time. So in the 1980s, I bracket the 1980s, for example, with 2 deaths that were deeply disturbing to her: the death of Roland Barthes in 1980, and the death, she would say, the murder of her father in 1989, and her emphasis in the 80s on all different forms of strangeness, feeling strange, feeling other, feeling outside. The 1990s was really about, I think that decade was about her coming to fiction. She started writing novels. She became an analyst. She began to suggest that revolt, resistance, is more important and ultimately more successful than revolution. And she began to write about female genius. So she wrote her book first on Hannah Arendt and moved on to Melanie Klein and Colette. The 2000s, she focused on religion and took a lot of flack for it. But what she was trying to think about was what she calls credo, the I believe, the need to believe, the desire to believe, and that desire to believe, that capacity to believe, is in crisis in the 2000s and 2010s. And she talks about how, particularly for young people, there's a crisis in ideality, a crisis of idealism. And she tries to argue, and it's very controversial, but she tries to argue for the development of new forms of secular humanism and what she calls singular universality, or new forms of universality, sort of feeling like the universal has been thrown out, the baby and the bathwater, in ways that perhaps we should revisit. In the 2010s, she continued to write about religion, met the Pope in 2011, that's a story, and began to think about this need to believe in the context of, for example, the terrorist attacks in Europe in 2015, 16, etc. And I end with the Sabina affair in 2018, which I'm going to talk about now for a few minutes. There is a coda at the very end of the book where I emphasize Kristeva's emphasis on the poetic through all of this, on the poetic, the intimate, and the psychic space in all of us that needs to be protected, whatever we call it, whether we call it spirit or soul or mind, whatever we call it. Her deepest belief is that that needs to be protected. And she's written quite a lot recently. If you look through newspapers and magazines, you'll find her newest articles on COVID and the pandemic, and how we need to protect that psychic space in each of us. Now I'm going to do something slightly more formal and read through some short remarks about why I think the book is timely, and with particular reference to the Sabina affair. So bear with me. The title is Who's Afraid of Julia Kristeva? ? As I elaborate in my introduction to the biography, I undertook this project because there is, in my opinion, no more urgent matter today than developing a new model of the intellectual. Through her emphasis on the need for an urgent revival of the humanities and the arts, does Kristeva offer us a new model of the intellectual that could be viable for the 21st century as we're living it? I think she does. I think it's a compelling model. She calls that model the contestatory intellectual. And yet, through all the research and interviews and writing of this book, I kept running up against an incredible, often brutal resistance to Kristeva as an intellectual from both the right and the left. But most consistently and most loudly, there have been the complaints about her allegiance to psychoanalysis. So I asked myself why. From Kristeva's own analysis with Ilse Barrande to her own analytic practice beginning in the 1970s, Kristeva's relationship with psychoanalytic thought occupies a central place in my biography. And this is because Kristeva herself has been remarkably consistent over her adult life. She has, in fact, been at her most passionate when she describes why and how her work as an analyst with an analysand coincides with and intersects with her work as a critic with a literary text. She has tried to search across practices, on the couch, in literature, in art, in religion, in mystical expression, for a freedom that is above all else creative, as well as an encounter with otherness that can break the chain of cause and effect and that revolts against any form of adaptation to a preordained plot. For Kristeva, the unconscious mind is where the social subject gets decentered, like meaning is decentered in a poetic text, and most acutely perhaps in modern literary texts. The unconscious and the poetic text are about the articulation of desire and love and hate, but without ready-made words or conventional moral codes. They're about what is too much for words. They're a dive into the unnameable, into strangeness, and at the border of what can be communicated. And Kristeva has always valued that moment. Analysis for Kristeva is a form of poetic listening with the analyst facilitating an interpretation that neither the analysand nor a poetic text can generate on its own. And from the beginning, she has wanted the analytic session to operate like a poem. After all, to analyze literature is to interpret a culture's dreams. She learned this directly as a child from the one volume of Freud that her father hid behind a bookcase in her Sofia home. But psychoanalysis has become, over recent years for Kristeva, not only about art, but increasingly about politics. She has said that her initial discovery of psychoanalysis already felt revolutionary, like a fragile resistance against the totalitarianism at the heart of her childhood. But most recently, she's argued that psychoanalysts today may be uniquely situated to fight the automatization of the human spirit, to critique the ordinary, to problematize the present in the context of a deeply and increasingly global crisis. Kristeva believes that we in the West have for a time been living in a period of wide mutation, where, for example, our relationships to time and space are being rapidly transformed by technology, where there is a rapid redistribution of sexual difference, and where this need to believe is making a dramatic comeback, but most often in distorted ways. She's not opposed to these mutations, but she is alarmed by some of their effects on world cultures badly prepared to incorporate them. When we are caught in the midst of these mutations without the necessary tools to understand or integrate them, our psychic space is in danger of being crushed. According to Kristeva, who's been a practicing analyst for 40 years, this is one of the greatest political dangers that we face today. While I don't think that she could have or would have diagnosed and prescribed and described this political danger in the early years of her psychoanalytic practice the way that she does today, her excited and serious discovery of psychoanalysis in the 1970s already contained her sense that the human psyche needed new forms of protection, and that psychoanalysts were up to the task. She decided to take the path of the unconscious, and she claims she's never regretted it. For Kristeva, cultural, social, and political events inscribe their temporalities within the most intimate spaces of the self, and the profound temporal mutations of the past few decades have, in her opinion, deeply affected the human psyche, and not for the better. Time is now hyper-accelerated and suspended. Most of us are trapped in a bizarre mixture of fast and slow, of presence and absence. We live in a time of sacrifice, what she calls maniacal narcissism, a time that is ultimately, she says, perfect for the, quote, avid consumers we all are and must be, unquote. Kristeva believes that this temporal chaos, which threatens to shut down psychic space, again, whatever you want to call it, mind, spirit, soul, which threatens to render human subjects robotic and mostly subservient to spectacle, must be fiercely resisted. She has increasingly outlined strategies for keeping the psychic space of our species alive in the struggle against developments that she says ultimately lead to nihilism, when not totalitarianism. And she sees this struggle as a fight literally to the death in the name of freedom, which, she repeats herself over and over, should not be confused with the word choice in the neoliberal sense of the term. And she struggles for a freedom in the name of renewed human connection, which she calls reliance. Just as those working in semiotics in the first half of the 20th century profoundly threatened Stalinist forms of totalitarianism, and just as Kristeva's post-structuralist insistence in the second half of the 20th century on revolt as an opening and reopening of psychic space, just as that deeply threatened the neoliberal authoritarian logics taking hold of Europe and North America. In the 21st century, there has been perhaps no intellectual or political task more complicated for Kristeva than to find ways to translate her firm belief that psychoanalytic theory and practice are essential for understanding and building the future of humanity, if indeed it is to have a future. Almost none of her recent defenses of psychoanalysis are new, but they are being articulated in new ways. Kristeva has stated emphatically that it was the combination of her intellectual explorations of artistic modernity with her youthful experiences of a totalitarian regime, one that punished creativity and freedom within a paranoid, schizoid political and cultural framework, that convinced her of the necessity to open up her psychoanalytic ear to the political configurations of the 21st century. And she decided to do this publicly in spite of and in response to the emergence in the 2000s of new mixtures of terroristic, nihilistic, and authoritarian attitudes. Otherwise, she argues, we become complicit in spreading what she calls the plague of complacency, unquote. Kristeva has become more and more explicit about her longtime sense that psychoanalytic listening is a form of resistance against totalitarian tendencies, both internal and external, and offers a barrier against the banalization of the ordinary and the commodification of everything. Throughout her publications and public lectures recently, she's been talking about the necessity for our social and political theory to include the intimate, an analysis of the intimate facets of the modern personality, which can be revealed and explored through psychoanalytic thought. She has chided psychoanalysts for being afraid to go public, for being unwilling to take into the public sphere what they're discovering in their private therapeutic spaces, their unwillingness to contest as public intellectuals. I would say that perhaps, at least in part, it's because they understand how ferocious the backlash can be. And this brings me to the question directly of who's afraid of Julia Kristeva and the question of the Sabina dossier in 2018. So let me read just a few pages from the book in that direction. And then a couple words to conclude. I received an email late on the evening of March 27th, 2018, with an article from the Balkan Insight. And the article was entitled, "Bulgaria alleges Julia Kristeva was a state security agent," unquote. I thought it was a hoax. The article stated flatly in almost comical bureaucratic prose that Kristeva was recruited on June 19th, 1971, important date, June 19th, 1971, by Senior Lieutenant Ivan Boshikov of the Communist State Security Foreign Intelligence Department, and that this was being reported by the Committee for Disclosing Documents and Announcing the Affiliation of Bulgarian Citizens to the State Security and Intelligence Services of the Bulgarian National Army. I remember acutely saying to myself, what? Variations of this headline appeared in multiple outlets after that. I was flabbergasted, confused, angry, worried all at once. Kristeva quickly issued a denial. Quote, "I have never belonged to any secret service, not Bulgarian, not French, not Russian or American. These archives are a perfect illustration of the methods used by police in the service of a totalitarianism that I have in fact helped to denounce by explaining in my publications how its mechanisms work," unquote. When I was contacted by the New York Times on March 29th, I knew exactly what I was going to say, that I believed Kristeva. Why? There are many reasons. Her adamant opposition to totalitarianism and totalitarian tendencies from since before she left Bulgaria, and especially after the brutal murder of her friends and her father. Her loud and articulate defense of Europe and of Western thought since her 20s. The myriad ways in which her integrity shines through whatever she writes, even when one might not agree with what she's saying. But in the end, the reason for my sureness that I found myself repeating over and over was quite simple. If she had been forced to do such a thing, if she had had no choice but to comply in order to protect her family and friends, let alone herself, she would have written about it the minute the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. She would have not been able to resist. Now, there are many strange, bizarre, and creepy things to say about this episode, but none are as uncanny to me as the fact that Kristeva was writing about Dostoevsky when the DS crashed back into her life in 2018, and that Kristeva's former sweetheart, her Bulgarian sweetheart, Svetan Stoyanov, was also writing about Dostoevsky when he was killed by the DS. As I mentioned before, and I'll just mention again briefly, Stoyanov met with Georgy Markov in London in January of 1971 in an attempt to convince Markov to return to Bulgaria. It didn't work. Markov stayed in London and was murdered by the Bulgarian secret services in September 1978. Stoyanov was last seen by friends in Sofia mid-June 1971. He was sick by July 1st, dead by July 3rd, 1971. When the headlines hit the global press in March 2018 about Kristeva, giving the date of her recruitment as June 19th, 1971, friends in Europe wrote me immediately, quote, "Kristeva must have chosen to live," unquote. Others, including myself, have speculated with circumstantial evidence that the communist bureaucrats were so upset about their failure with Markov and so worried about what their superiors would think that they doubled down in mid-June 1971 on their other two most visible and celebrated intellectuals of the time. And Stoyanov ended up dead, and Kristeva became Sabina and an object of surveillance. Object of surveillance for over 20 years. As I have during the past year been pulled into the strange post-Soviet world that produced the Dossier Committee and its so-called truths, I've been as if possessed by the uncanny similarity between what's happening in post-communist Eastern Europe and in Donald Trump's United States. Both seem to be caught in a web of post-truth, post-fact, conspiracy-driven narratives with no way to figure out what's truth and what's fiction. It's difficult to trace how much the disinformation campaigns that originated in post-Soviet Russia, but which are modeled on communist-era propaganda strategies, are to blame for the increase of disinformation on American social media under Trump. And this is not a topic I can develop right now. But as for trying to understand post-communist Bulgaria, I tend to turn to literature in order to find the words to describe the completely dystopian aura that I find there. I use words like Orwellian or Kafkaesque and wonder if maybe Kristeva felt like Gregor Samsa in 2018, waking up as a bug. The best work, I think, on trying to understand the bizarre, paranoid, schizoid, post-Soviet fantasy world at work in Bulgaria and perhaps other places is, of course, being done in Bulgaria and in Slavic studies. Philosophers in Sofia like Miglena Nikolchina are analyzing in depth the dizzying impossibility of proving what the secret services were up to during the Soviet era. She's uncovered strategies they used, such as working in the dark, where the targets that they were surveilling had no idea that this was happening to them. And this may be, I think, the strategy that was used with Kristeva. And how in the present time, the victims of these strategies have no power to stop the slander. And I'll just quote Nikolchina quickly. And while the battle around the truth of Kristeva goes on, a more terrible and totally ignored truth emerges. The kudos of the communist secret services in Bulgaria seems to have never wavered. Few of us dare to doubt them, their truth, their power to provide the truth. Why should we? The secret services were busy molesting and destroying intellectuals in the past. They seem to be able to go on doing this decades after their presumed demise. Look at what they can do to Kristeva today. She tried to escape them. She even got to Paris, to New York, to world renown. And yet, here they are. They got her. So let me just say, in conclusion, yes, they definitely got her. Kristeva was definitely sideswiped by history in 2018, and she will no doubt be haunted and harassed about it for some time to come. But in our bizarre post-Cold War atmosphere today, my question is, why Kristeva? Why now? Who's afraid of Julia Kristeva? Why attack this intellectual now? Who benefits? Is this just old-fashioned misogyny, jealousy? Is it garden variety hostility towards intellectuals, or in the United States against anyone associated with post-war French theory? Some see the attacks on Kristeva as part of a wider project by right-wing, anti-democratic, and populist forces to discredit European institutions and pro-European intellectuals. And no doubt that's true. But there is something about the attack that I think is curiously specific to Kristeva, the psychoanalytic public intellectual. I predict that the damage from this attack against Kristeva will not last long, for none of it is about what is important in her life and work. What's important? What I think and what I've tried to emphasize in this biography is the fact that Kristeva's entire adult life, firmly grounded in her childhood, has been about finding ways as a reader, as a writer, as a psychoanalyst, as a teacher, as a public intellectual, to protect psychic space. In writing on the couch, in the public sphere, contesting authoritarian, when not totalitarian tendencies, wherever she sees them, regardless of whatever macro politics might be involved. And her primary way of doing that has involved a return to the poets, to the language of poetic process, as that which best protects the increasingly fragile psychic space in all of us. In our current historical moment, with authoritarian threats emerging from within and from without, I've tried to make a timely argument in this book through the telling of an extraordinary life story, arguing around the edges that, yes, the determined fusion of psychoanalytic and poetic insight on the part of an influential public intellectual like Julia Kristeva not only contests, but apparently strikes abject fear into the hearts of authoritarian, when not totalitarian, agents and personalities everywhere. And also arguing that, yes, it is possible to find the courage to resist the demagoguery of fear wherever and for whatever reasons it rears its ugly head. In 2016, in answer to Friedrich Holderlin's question, but of what use are the poets in times of distress? Kristeva answered, quote, if you can find the meaning of the world in the poetic fullness of language, the totalitarian hold can't threaten you anymore, unquote. And I'll stop there. And I think, Catherine, we have time for some questions. Thank you all. I'm looking at your faces, and there are people on the screen who know a lot more about some of this, especially this time period in Eastern Europe, than I do. And also folks that I would love to just sit down over a glass of wine or a cup of coffee and talk about all of this with them. So I'll let Catherine take over.
Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you for the reading and your remarks. That was fantastic. And yes, we do have quite a distinguished audience with us tonight from across the globe. I'd like to invite you guys at this point to please submit any questions via the chat feature, and I will read them aloud as soon as they're coming in. We'll get to as many as we can.
It's so much fun seeing all of you from all these different pieces of my life.
It's a nice collection, isn't it? That's sort of that's been the silver lining of the pandemic for me, is to host these wonderful events and actually, you know, gather not just the people we would have gotten in Paris in our space, but also your colleagues, your friends, and from all over the globe. It's really great.
Really quite something. It really is.
I might sort of launch in here with the first question then. Where can we buy the book, Alice?
Oh my gosh. So, well, that's a good first question. I must have done my job. So there are many ways to buy the book. At the moment, I did check this morning. The least expensive way, I'm sorry to say, is to just go on Amazon. That's the least expensive. So sorry to say that. Bloomsbury also sells the book, and the good thing about Bloomsbury is there's an automatic discount. They also have an e-version and several different kinds, you know, of versions. They have a Kindle, so that's a good way. I used to have a discount form, and there may be a discount form in the internet somewhere, but one of those, you know, or a local bookstore is what I would encourage if you possibly can. I know that Harvard Bookstore, for those of you in Cambridge, and Porter's Square Books and a few others in the area have copies.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm getting a couple of questions now. So the first one's coming in from Tony, who's wondering, to what degree did you speak with or connect with Kristeva in the writing of the book?
Interesting question, because one of the things for any of you who've actually read it, had time to read it, I sort of do away with, in the introduction, with the assumption or the presumption that I would follow the rules of writing a biography. I'm not neutral. I'm not some floating out here telling the story. I'm really quite involved in telling the story, and Kristeva was a big part of that. She and I have known each other for, 30 years. But in particular, I spent some time with her in 2012 on the Ile de Ré, where we were able to sit for many hours, several days, and talk about her life. And then in 2014, I traveled to Sofia and in Bulgaria, where I was able to just walk around with her all over Sofia and see the places that were important to her as a child. And in the most extraordinary way for me is see what a diva she is in Bulgaria. I had to learn how to walk backwards because we were always being accosted by, 10 or 15 television stations, wanting to talk to her, wanting to talk to me. It was extraordinary. And I'll stop. But there was a moment I'll never forget, walking into the university where she was going to give a talk. And I write about it in the biography. And when we walked in, the place was packed. People were literally hanging off the rafters. There were thousands of people. It was huge. And people stood up and gave her a standing ovation for about 15 minutes. And people were crying. It was incredible. And I'm really glad I went, because I almost didn't go because it was such a big trip. But I'm really glad I went. So she had a lot of input and a lot of impact, and I own it.
Absolutely. All right. So for the next question, this one's from Kathy, who's writing, can you say something more about Kristeva's idea of maniacal narcissism? For example, what's its place in her view of problems today?
Yeah, well, that's a long story, but I would venture to say that for Kristeva, as we move through this, through these mutations that she writes about in sort of mostly in the 2000s and 2010s, a mutation in belief, and in particular in the default of organized religion, but the increase in the desire and the need to believe in something, that as we move through that, and technological change, and other kinds of economic and global change, we become very fragile and our psychic space is assaulted. And particularly if we have an intimate relationship with technology, social media platforms, etc., spectacle, any form of spectacle for her. Then what happens is I'm trying to squish this. We become entangled in various neoliberal narratives of being completely thrown back on ourselves as individuals. If you don't make it in life, it's your fault. If you don't do this, you don't do that, it's your fault. Sort of what we would refer to in English as, kind of rampant individualism. And what happens when you're constantly assaulted that way, I'm not saying I think this is the way she would begin to argue this, is that you're thrown back on a kind of infantile state of need for narcissistic pleasure. And that can become, she would argue, maniacal. It can become selfish, it can become self-involved, and it can become non-relational. And that's what she's been writing about most in terms of COVID, mostly in journalistic prose, but she's gotten a little bit more theoretical lately, that the big danger and the big opportunity of this pandemic. The big danger is, of course, this complete subservience to spectacle and a sort of relationship to the media that's, among other things, unhealthy. But also the possibility of renewed connection, even if only electronic for the moment, what she has written about as reliance. And she takes that back to childhood as well, of course, because she's a psychoanalyst. So she talks about the mother and the child and that relationship. And if that relationship is destroyed, then we're in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble because of the ways in which the psyche cannot adapt. Now that is a very, I'm sitting here looking at a couple of faces and getting very nervous, but there's a very brief description of, I think, some of the ways in which she's arguing about that, worried about that.
Okay, great. We've got another question from Megan, who's wondering, did Kristeva mostly focus her writings on Western societies, or does she also write on Eastern cultures and regimes? I'm curious about any views on the Eastern spiritual practices versus the various totalitarian regimes. So I think you can interpret East here as you want, I think.
Yeah, the East problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me say, and again, this is another topic we could sit here and chat about for 2 hours or more. So let me say that one of the most consistent critiques of Kristeva's work over the decades has been that it's been so Western, and her pro-European stance has led to a lot of controversy. When she does turn to other cultures, it's very selective. She has, as many of you know, written quite a lot about China, about Chinese culture. She's traveled to China multiple times. When I go to conferences, the Chinese delegations from Shanghai and Beijing and other places in China are among the most numerous participants. She's adored in China. And I think in part because, not only because she's made herself quite familiar with Chinese history and Chinese philosophy and Chinese religions, but because there's something about this opening, this protection of the psychic space that speaks to these intellectuals in China who are in a very precarious position in what remains a totalitarian state, and yet has all of these openings and new forms of resistance going on. There are people on the screen who've been to China since I have been there, so know very well the kinds of resistance that's going on there. So yeah, she only very recently has started writing about Eastern Europe, and it doesn't always go well. And that's another story. But yeah, she's very protective of Western literature and Western European philosophy. She's very protective, and in sort of that, along those lines of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, she was a loud critic, right, of traditional humanism and traditional forms of universalist thinking, et cetera. She was one of the loudest critics in the 70s, and she took a lot of flack for that. More recently, she's been more nuanced and sort of saying, well, hang on a second. Maybe what we need to do is what you do in analysis when you go on the couch and you get analyzed. Maybe what we need to do is some collaboration here. Maybe we need to revisit the history of humanism and the history of universalism and rethink it in a more global kind of way that allows different kinds of actors to invest in the conversation. And so that's where she's been going more recently.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're about to run out of time here, but I think I will sneak one more in here. So this question is, could you talk a little bit more about Kristeva's vision of relationships and the place of love in her work?
Oh, yeah, it was fascinating. There are several of you who I was emailing with endlessly when I was trying to figure out what to say about Kristeva and love, especially once I really understood the story of Dominique Collin. So I think in the time we have, what I would emphasize, if you look in that section in part 2 where I explain the Dominique Collin story, I do try to go more deeply into Kristeva's theory of love, which is based on the mother-child relationship and this idea of reliance, of connection, also reliance. So for example, she would argue that in any erotic partnership of any kind, she's very, she goes, there have to be 4 things. There has to be financial independence on the part of each partner. You have to remain, each of you has to be financially independent or else it doesn't work. You each have to be able to stay singular in your life's work. That is, you have to You have to be different. You have to be able to pursue your own interests without judging the other person. But you have to respect what the other person does, even if you don't like it or you can't do it. You have to respect it. And her most important, which brings me back to the question, her most important requirement for at least romantic love, if not other kinds of love, is care and fidelity. She believes that that the care that one thinks of in the mother-child relationship has to be there in any other kind of love relationship. You really have to care about the other person, even when you want to strangle them. And you have to commit to a certain kind of fidelity to them, no matter what. And she would require that even of friendship. One of the ways in which Kristeva and I think, have connected is around the belief that friends have to be loyal to friends. You can argue, you can even, make a fuss, but there's a certain kind of caring and fidelity that has to be there, or you won't stay friends. So I don't know if that answers that question, but.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alice. I think ending on friendship is a wonderful and positive way to finish this wonderful discussion. Thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really grateful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And I'll finish quickly by just saying a couple more words. So if anybody's interested in attending any of our other free public virtual events, feel free to check out our homepage and sign up for anything that might be of interest to you. I just wanted to point out one of those events. So next Wednesday, the 16th of September, we'll be hosting Mamta Chaudhry, who's going to be speaking on her beautiful debut novel, Haunting Paris. She'll be in conversation with Russell Banks that evening. So I hope many of you can come as well to that. And I did want to remind everybody that since we are a nonprofit, we do welcome donations. Normally in person, we'd be very glad to accept €10 donations at the entrance. This is a bit different going virtual, but I did include the link to donate in my email with the meeting details. So please, if you'd like to support the American Library in Paris, please give that a click and show some support during this unconventional centennial year. Thank you again, Alice, for joining us, and thank you for your lovely questions, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. And email me with questions you still have. Okay.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao. Thank you.